Hello. Here we are. Say their names square. Ongoing teaching. Okay. This is. Hello. There we are. First bus. Alright. Ongoing teaching. Say their name square. We're finishing up Rise of the Warrior Cop. Got 10 pages left. It's book 6 on day 7. Hopefully we get that straightened out. Why can't investigators handle common drug offenders the same way? A big reason is a lack of resources. If your department is serving several drug warrants a day, you just aren't going to have the personnel to come up with that sort of plan for each one. A second reason is that drug offenders simply aren't all that likely to shoot at cops. And it's easier to use violent tactics against people who aren't going to fire back. It's by no means a universal rule, but often when police do face a genuinely violent suspect like an escaped fugitive with a violent history, a suspect in a series of violent crimes, or a barricade of hostage situation, they don't immediately storm the place. They set up a perimeter or try to figure out other ways to make the arrest safely. This again isn't possible with drug warrants. There are just too many of them. But because drug dealers aren't all that dangerous, it works out to raid them instead. Police today are also given too little training in counseling and dispute resolution, and what little training they do get in the academy is quickly blotted out by what they learn on the street in the first few months on the job. When you're given an excess of training in the use of force but little in using psychology, body language, and other non-coercive means of resolving in conflict, you'll naturally gravitate toward force. I think about the notion of command presence, Stamper says. When you, as a police officer, show up at a chaotic or threatening or dangerous situation, you need to demonstrate your command presence, that you are the person in command of this situation. You do this with your bearing, your body language, and your voice. What I see today is that the well-disciplined... What I see today is that this well-disciplined notion of command presence has been shattered. Cops today...
Well, I didn't light no candle. I'm the one that grabbed the basket and put the thing there. Whoever wants to light the candle, it's all on them.
Yeah, I did it.
Good. Light it again. Wait for it. It's going to be calm today. Light. There'll be a thunderstorm. Yeah, there's a thunderstorm coming this afternoon. A big one.
Cops today think you show... Hey, leave him alone.
He's my friend.
I don't give a fuck. Leave him alone. Don't kick him again.
I'll leave him alone. I'll respect you. Say hi, boy. I'll be right back. Give me a quick hand. I do the roundabout.
Cops today think you show command presence by yelling and screaming. In my day, if you went to a screaming, out-of-control presence, you had failed in that situation as a cop. You'd be pulled aside by a senior cop or sergeant and made to understand in no uncertain terms that you were out of line. The very best cops I ever worked around were quiet, which isn't to say they were withdrawn or passive, but they were quiet. Which isn't to say, they understand the value of silence, the powerful effect of a pause. Stamper adds that these things aren't emphasized anymore. Verbal persuasion is the first tool a police officer has. The more effective he or she is as a communicator, the less likely it is he or she is going to get impulsive or need to. Neil Franklin suggests that deteriorating physical violence at police departments can also lead to unnecessary escalations of force. Another argument in favor of foot patrols over car patrols. When I was commander of training in Baltimore, one of the first things I did was evaluate the physical condition of the police officers themselves, Franklin says. The overweight guys were the guys who knew very little about rest control and defensive strategy. Being a police officer is a physically demanding job. You can't be so out of shape. When you are, you're less confident about less lethal force. It can get so that the only use of force you're capable of using is a firearm. You also fear physical confrontation, so you're more likely to reach for your firearm earlier. Getting cops in shape is a confidence builder, and it gets people away from relying too much on the weapons they have on their belt. More generally, politicians should also be held accountable when they use war rhetoric to discuss crime and illicit drugs. Words do have an impact on the way police officers approach their jobs and the way they view the people with whom they interact while on patrol. If we want to dissuade them from seeing their fellow citizens as the enemy, we need to stop our political leaders, the people who set the policies and appropriate the budgets for those officers, from referring to their fellow citizens as the enemy. Accountability. In numerous states across the country, police unions have lobbied legislatures to pass variations on a law enforcement Bill of Rights. Though they vary from state to state, the general thrust of these laws is to afford police officers accused of crimes additional rights above and beyond what regular citizens get. Or as Reason Magazine's Mike Riggs puts it, the intent of such laws is to shield cops from the law they're paid to enforce. These laws have made it nearly impossible to fire bad cops in many jurisdictions, and worse, they have instilled in them the notion that they're above the law and above the regular citizens they're supposed to serve. Investigations of how bad cops are able to stay on the job have become a perennial newspaper undertaking. Recent exposés have tracked the flawed system in Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, West Virginia, and Chicago. This is one of the main issues in Rockford. We have an accountability problem. There's a culture of impunity in the Rockford Police Department. Like Dominic McNeese shot Tyrus Jones in the back, was ruled justified, and then months later is out kicking Denzel in the face while he's handcuffed and face down in the snow. Part of the problem is that union management negotiations in law enforcement are decidedly different from those in the private sector. For one, there's little downside for a mayor or a city council to give everything away. Voters rarely get angry at politicians for being too generous with the police, but when city officials face tight budgets, they can use accountability as a negotiating chip, offering more job protections for cops accused of wrongdoing in exchange for concessions on pay or benefits. A CEO who negotiates away his ability to hold his employees accountable is likely to feel the repercussions on his bottom line. It affects him directly. When city officials make it more difficult to fire bad cops, they are rarely affected that way. At worst, a lawsuit might take a bite out of a city budget, but no cops will be harassing or beating the politicians themselves. That happens to other people. Police unions also help enforce the Blue Code of Silence. the unwritten rule that police officers never rat out or testify against other police officers. A stark example from several years ago in New Mexico involved, oddly enough, former race car driver Al Unser Jr. Sr. In 2006, Albuquerque police officer Sam Costales testified against some deputies from the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department. The deputies had gotten into a confrontation with Unser that resulted in Unser's arrest and criminal charges. Costales had witnessed the incident. At Unser's trial, he testified that Unser did not assault or threaten officers from the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department, as claimed in police reports. Costales' testimony helped Unser win an acquittal. None of the Bernalillo deputies was disciplined, but one officer was, Sam Costales. His own chief opened an internal affairs investigation of him. Costales' transgression. He wore his police uniform when he testified in Unser's case. Albuquerque cops apparently are permitted to wear the uniform when they're testifying for the prosecution, but not when they're testifying for the defense. At that point, the Albuquerque Police Union got involved, but not to protect Officer Costales. He may have been disciplined for telling the truth, but for the union he committed the far more serious offense of telling an unflattering truth about his fellow cops. James Badway, secretary of the Albuquerque Police Officers Association, apologized for Costales' actions in an email message to the Bernalillo sheriff. As secretary of the APOA, I feel it is my duty and responsibility to apologize to you and your officers. Officer Sam Costales does not represent APD or APOA. The majority of our officers look at the BCSO as our brother and sisters in blue. We are embarrassed and ashamed of Officer Costales' testimony in the Unser trial. If there is anything we can do to rebuild the damage caused by Sam, please let me know. Only in law enforcement would a union rep apologize to the management for the actions of one of its members. Former narcotics cop Russ Jones says the unions reinforce the notion among cops that it's just them and their brother cops against the world. Police unions have really gotten to the point where they protect bad police officers, and they shield management from having to take any responsibility, Jones says. Everybody involved in the bargaining wins. The citizen ends up the losers in all aspects. Perhaps the biggest problem with police unions, however, is that they present a major obstacle to real reform. Their political clout is difficult to surmount. Democrats don't cross them because of the traditional alliance of unions and public employees. Republicans rarely cross them because of the party's law and order reputation. But awareness of their formidable influence and likely opposition to any accountability efforts is at least a start. Good ideas for accountability policies include civilian review boards, but only if they have subpoena power, are granted the authority to impose discipline, and can't be overruled by arbitrators. Unfortunately, there aren't many in the country that have those powers, and as we saw with the death of Alberta Spruill, Spruill, yeah. Even a major headline-grabbing scandal isn't enough to establish credible civilian oversight. The most productive accountability policy, and thus the most controversial and least likely to be adopted, would be to impose more liability on police officers who make egregious errors. Under the qualified immunity from civil lawsuits currently afforded to police under federal law, A police officer can't be sued for mere negligence or even for gross negligence that results in a fatality. To even get into court against a police officer, a plaintiff must show not only that a police officer intentionally violated the plaintiff's constitutional rights, but that said rights were well established at the time they were violated. With this protection, police officers aren't required to keep informed on the latest court decisions that pertain to their job. In fact, in a perverse way, it even discourages police departments and officers from doing so. A cop who is aware that he was violating someone's rights is much more likely to be found liable than a cop who isn't. So that kind of explains some of the responses we've gotten from police when we ask about our charges or ask what law we broke to get these charges. The police always say, well, that's what court is for. They don't want to admit that they know, which they probably don't anyway because they're stupid, but that would this encourages their stupidity. Some commentators, like University of Texas law professor Glenn Reynolds, have suggested that SWAT teams that conduct forced entry raids be held to a strict liability standard. If they raid the wrong house, they're liable for damages no matter what. Whether the mistake was due to a bad informant, a mistyped address, or just a bad investigation wouldn't matter. Such a policy would be difficult to apply in many cases. For example, if police claim in the affidavit that they're looking for a large stash of heroin, but raid a house that turns up only a small amount of pot, would that be considered a wrong house raid? Still, adopting the policy just for cases of clear, unambiguous mistakes would probably encourage more caution, more restraint, and fewer errors. The most difficult change is the one that's probably necessary to make any of these others happen. The public needs to start caring about these issues. The proliferation of cop watch sites, citizen shot video of police misconduct, and coverage of police abuse incidents by a bevy of online media is encouraging. Another good sign is the fact that the growing skepticism of police has been accompanied by a decline in violence against police officers themselves. Activists are fighting police abuse with technology and information, not with threats and violence. But while exposing individual incidents of misconduct is important, particularly to the victim of the misconduct, it's more important to expose the policies that allow misconduct to flourish. Bad systems will continue to turn out bad results, and bad systems will never be reformed until and unless policymakers and politicians A, are convinced there is a problem, and B, pay a political price for not addressing it. Yes, trends that develop over years or decades can gradually normalize things that we might not have tolerated had they been imposed on us all at once. But it's still rather remarkable that domestic police officers are driving tanks and armored personnel carriers on American streets, breaking into homes and killing dogs over pot. They're subjecting homes and businesses to commando raids for white-collar and even regulatory offenses, and there's been barely any opposition or concern from anyone in Congress, any governor, or any mayor of a sizable city that more than anything is what needs to change. Yeah, I disagree. Conclusion. Yeah, I don't know if I want to go back over this chapter because I didn't read most of it, but the whole thing with Calvo and he was the mayor of uh, He had he was the mayor of Berwyn Heights, which is near D.C. And the cops raided his home, held his mother-in-law at gunpoint, shot his dogs, spread their blood all over the house by walking in the blood and then walking all over the house, and then all over that they found pot in a package that they didn't ask for, got delivered to their house. And when they found out that it was delivered to their house, they raided the house thinking it was a drug house. But it was actually the mayor of Berwyn Heights. Then later said that they did nothing wrong, that the mayor had done nothing wrong, and that the cops had done nothing wrong. All right, conclusion. Page 333. The war on drugs, I liken it to the Vietnam War, hit and miss. There is no clear win. We don't know if we're gaining ground or not. What we want to do is we want to change our strategy. We want to make this more like a Normandy invasion. Former Clayton County, Georgia Sheriff Victor Hill. The way these people are treated has to be judged in the context of a war. Hollandale, Florida, attorney Richard Kane after city police mistakenly raided Edwin and Catherine Bernhardt. I have my own army in the NYPD, the 7th largest army in the world. New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Officers' safety comes first, and not infringing on people's rights comes second. Philadelphia Police Department spokesman Fran Healy. My message to my troops is, if you see anybody carrying a gun on the streets of Milwaukee, we'll put them on the ground, take the gun away, and then decide whether you have a right to carry it. Milwaukee Police Chief Ed Flynn describing how his officers would harass legal gun owners in spite of Wisconsin state law. Given that the founders could never have anticipated police as they exist today, maybe are cops constitutional is the wrong question. A better one might be, are today's police forces consistent with the principles of a free society? That's a good question. It's difficult to say that they are. Police today are armed, dressed, trained, and conditioned like soldiers. They're given greater protections from civil and criminal liability than normal citizens. They're permitted to violently break into homes, often at night, to enforce laws against nonviolent consensual acts, and even then, often on rather flimsy evidence of wrongdoing, negligence, and errors in judgment that result in needless terror, injury, and death are rarely held accountable. Citizens who make similar errors under the same circumstances almost always face criminal charges, usually felonies. Police today share a bond tighter than that shared by soldiers who fight in wars together. There's a strict code of omerta that's enforced more ruthlessly and thoroughly than any other non-criminal profession. Cops who rat out other cops tend not to remain cops for very long. Lying and exaggerating in police reports and on the witness stand isn't just common, it's routine and expected. It's a part of the job. Today, there are entire communities in which a large percentage of residents refuse to talk to police under any circumstances. These so-called stop snitching movements are often derided by politicians and police officials, but they're pretty astonishing revelation driving them. There are large swaths of the population who fear the people who are supposed to protect them from criminals more than they fear the criminals. As I've written and spoken on this issue over the years, I've even had current and former members of the military tell me they object to the word militarization, not because they disagree with the basic premise of what's happened to police departments in recent years, but because from their own experience the military is more accountable and disciplined than many police departments today. Several have even told me that military raids on residences where they suspected insurgents may be hiding are done more carefully and with more deference to the rights of potential innocents than some of the SWAT raids they see and read about today. The police today may be more militarized than the military. Police officers today are a protected class, one no politician wants to oppose. Law enforcement interests may occasionally come up short on budgetary issues, but legislatures rarely, if ever, pass new laws to hold police more accountable, to restrict their powers, or to make them more transparent. In short, police today embody all of the threats the founders feared were posed by standing armies, plus a few additional ones they couldn't have anticipated. This isn't to say we're in a police state, a term that's often misused. I don't agree. I do not agree with you, Mr. Radley. Balko. All right, we got 1.5 pages left of the book 6 on day 7. Leslie just fell asleep while reading. Just like a half hour ago. I've only been reading about a half hour. I'm going to finish up this 1.5 pages and then I'll stop the live. This isn't to say we're in a police state, a term that's often misused. Generally speaking, we're free to travel. We don't face mass censorship. We still have habeas corpus, and we do face mass censorship. Surveillance, which is censorship. We still have habeas corpus, not really, and the odds of any single person being victimized by a wrongdoer raid, shot or beaten by a cop, or otherwise victimized by militarized police violence are slim to nil. I think that's relevant. An injustice to one is an injustice to all. But perhaps we have entered a police state writ small. At the individual level, a police officer's power and authority over the people he interacts with day to day is near complete. Absent video, if the officer's account of an incident differs from that of a citizen, even several citizens, his superiors, the courts, and the prosecutors will nearly always defer to the officer. If other officers are nearby, there are policies in place, official and unofficial, to encourage them to back one another up. Even if the officer does violate the citizen's rights, the officer is protected by qualified immunity. In the introduction, I noted that this is not an anti-cop book, and it isn't. Despite all of this, there are still good cops. Oh boy. A lot of them. Oh man. None of them seem to have found their way to Rockford. But we have passed laws and policies that have elevated police officers above the people they serve. As Tim Lynch of the Cato Institute has written, you could make a good argument that police should be held to a higher standard than regular citizens, and you could make a good argument they should be held to the same standard. But it's hard to conceive of a convincing argument that they should be held to a lower one. But that's exactly what they've done. Systems governed by bad policies and motivated by incentives will produce bad outcomes. Today, laws, policies, and procedures select for personalities attracted to aggressive, antagonistic policing. isolate police from the communities they serve, and condition police officers to see the people they serve, the people with whom they interact every day, as the enemy. We shouldn't then be surprised when cops then begin to see a world divided between cops and their families and everybody else. Perhaps most distressing of all, not only does the military continue to provide surplus weapons to domestic police agencies, but thanks to the Department of Homeland Security grants, military contractors are now shifting to market resources toward policy agencies. Worse, a new industry appears to be emerging just to convert those grants into battle-grade gear. The means will soon have powerful private interests, funded by government grants, who will lobby for more government grants to pay for further militarization. A police industrial complex. It's a threshold that will be difficult to uncross. No, America's today isn't a police state, far from it, but it would be foolish to wait until it becomes one to get concerned. I totally disagree with you. We live in a police state. The police have all the power. Just the other night, we got raided, and the cop willy-nilly's pointing his light around that I gotta stand in the light. The examples go on and on. I asked a cop for his name and badge number and was arrested and banned from the hospital. They came out of the hospital, told us we could not go in the hospital, and then came out. When I asked them their names and badge numbers, they arrested me and banned me from the hospital. How is that not a police state? The police have taken my phones for no reason. They say it's evidence, but there's no evidence about what had happened on the phones. Kept them for months. I don't know. Just seems totally, after all he goes through with killing dogs and killing people and children in front of their parents, and that he thinks that it's not a police state. Maybe he hasn't been to Rockford, but I know that it's everywhere, so it's ridiculous. As far as the conclusion, I wish he would have wrapped up a little more with the castle doctrine that he opened with. Are today's police forces consistent with the principles of a free society? No, this is not a free society. Another thing that's happened to me is that there's been no contact orders with me, with people that are my friends or my comrades in struggle, because they arrested us at the same lawful protest. We were lawfully assembling, as is in the First Amendment, and then they arrested us for lawfully assembling, and then because they arrested us together, they put no contact orders on us, between us, so that we could not associate with each other. How is that a free society? It is not a free society. It is a police state. All right, that's it. Finished Rise of the Warrior Cop, book 6, but on day 7. Next up will be A Peculiar Indifference. Or no, it isn't. Sorry. Wrong book. Until We Reckon. Violence, Mass Incarceration, and A Road to Repair. Which I heard is supposed to be the the new Jim Crow, but this was like a general overview, and this is about uh, uh, violent crimes, felonies, violent crimes. All right, we're ending this live.